18. Book of Luke, chapter 18. Very familiar passage of Scripture. We'd like to read verses 9 through verse 14. And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and despised others. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee, the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself: God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. This, of course, is known as the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. It's one of the better known parables of Christ. Christ often spoke in parables. Luke records the largest number of them, 24, Luke records, with 18 of them being exclusive to Luke. That is, the other gospel writers do not record. And this is one of those that are exclusive to Luke. Now, a parable, of course, is a fictitious story for the purpose of teaching and illustrating a particular lesson or truth. So it's really a simple illustration of a complex truth. When it comes to parables, it's important to keep in mind that the main thing is not the story, not the parable, but the truth that the parable illustrates. And Christ's design in speaking parables was not for entertainment to the hearers. That's not the purpose. Nor was it a means to keep their attention. But the whole purpose was to illustrate truth in a way that they could understand. Jesus said in Matthew 13 and also in Mark chapter 4, and I paraphrase, many understand the story that is being told, but they miss the truth that is illustrated. That was one of the problems with the people hearing parables. They understood the story, but they missed the truth. And that's still a problem today. Many of God's people, they understand the story, but they miss completely the truth that is being illustrated. And again, the main thing is not the story. The main thing is the truth that is being illustrated. So Jesus spoke many parables, and there are various applications in each one, but every parable has a specific and emphasized point of truth. In other words, there's a central lesson in each of the parables. Now, this particular parable follows the parable of the persevering widow. And we see the purpose of that parable in Luke 18, verse 1, was that men ought always to pray. That was the purpose of it. It's not the emphasis of it, though. The emphasis, the heart of that parable, you go down to verse 8, you see was persevering faith. trust in God, which of course would lead people to pray. And in the parable before us now, Christ is rebuking, verse 9, those which trusted in themselves that they were righteous. So their trust was that they, in and of themselves, were righteous. They trusted in themselves that they were righteous. As a result, they despised others. We're not going to get into that part of it, but that always goes hand in hand. If a person is self-righteous, they'll also despise others. Notice that in this parable, it says that, verse 9, he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves. The preposition unto, he's speaking to them. He's not speaking about them. He is speaking directly to them. He is rebuking, he is warning these, and he does this, and he does so by this parable. He's also providing them hope in God. That is, the mercy of God. So the actual parable is verses 10 through 14. And immediately, our attention is drawn to two men. One is a Pharisee. They were zealous for outward obedience to God. They paid no attention to the inward. They were regarded as the spiritual leaders of the entire nation. And the other, we read, was a publican. That is, he was a tax collector. These were hired by the Romans when they imposed their oppressive taxes on people that they had conquered. These tax collectors were Jews hired by the Romans. They became rich on the commissions they made from serving Rome against their own people. So needless to say, they were a hated group of people. And these two, verse 10, went up into the temple to pray. This would have reference to the fact that twice a day, 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., which was the morning and evening sacrifice, and you had the burnt offering. All this is explained in Leviticus 1. This is what this is referring to. This blood sacrifice was a symbol, of course, a type of the atonement. And these two men went up to pray. They participated in this prayer time. And the prayers are recorded. And they couldn't be any more different. Both of them prayed, but their heart and their approach to God, again, couldn't be more different. Most believe, because it is said they went up to pray, that this is a parable about prayer. But it really isn't. There are lessons about prayer and how we should approach God, no doubt. But remember who he's speaking to. Which trusted in themselves that they were righteous. That's the target audience of this parable. And though the parable most certainly contains lessons about how we approach God in prayer, that's not the emphasis. The emphasis is, verse 14, justification before God. How one is justified before God. So the point of the parable is that man is not justified by God in his own righteousness, but such is the work of God. So in the parable, Christ calls our attention to a Pharisee. The reason to illustrate those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. He calls our attention to a publican. The purpose for doing so is to rebuke and to correct those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. So in the parable, you have God, there is this Pharisee, and there is this publican. And both the Pharisee and the publican are sinners. So the parable, in reality, there are two characters, not three. God and the sinner. That's the two characters in the parable. And so it is today. You have God and you have the sinner. Now the sinner is portrayed in the Pharisee and in the publican. And these two, the Pharisee and the publican, is the division of all religious systems. It is the division of all theological views of salvation. You see, religion is not as complicated and as complex as most think. Either you are just before God in and of yourselves, or it's all of God. And all religion divides. It's one or the other. Doesn't matter what the religion is. It's one or the other. They may have different ways of wording it, different ways of explaining it, but it all comes down to those two things. In other words, you are either the means of your own justification, or you're not. It's that simple. It is either you can achieve the righteousness which God requires, the righteousness that satisfies Him, or you can't. It's one or the other. And the world's system of religion, throughout history, all the way back to the garden, is you get to God by being and doing good. And that is what makes you acceptable to God. Now, what Jesus illustrates in the parable is the reverse of that thinking. So we want to develop the thought of the message. We're not really going to look so much into the parable. We want to develop the thought of the message from the prayer of the publican. Verse 13. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And we want to notice three words. Me, a sinner. Me, a sinner. Whether saved or unsaved, those three words are true of all of us. There are two kinds of people here today. There are unsaved sinners. There are saved sinners. So that's our subject. Me, a sinner. Very briefly, in the parable, there's God. He's perfect. He's undefiled. He's free from all spot. He's free from all blemish. He's perfectly pure. He's perfectly sinless, perfectly righteous in Himself. He's perfectly holy. He's all holy. Everything about Him is holy. He's only holy. He's altogether holy. He's always holy. Because God is holy, He abhors sin. He abhors sin universally. He abhors sin perpetually. He abhors sin intensely. God is just. God is holy. God is just. He must judge sin. And only a perfect righteousness meets and satisfies the demands of a holy and just God. So you have God. In the parable, there's the sinner, illustrated again in the Pharisee and the publican. Both of these men are sinners. But their attitude, how they see themselves, are polar opposite. They're both sinners, but they see themselves differently. Each and every one of us are sinners. And the Word of God very plainly declares that all are sinners by birth, by nature, and therefore sinners by practice. We hear David declare in Psalm 51:5, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." Psalm 58, verse 3, "The wicked are estranged from the womb, they go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies." And it is declared in 2 Kings 8, verse 46, "There is no man, saved or unsaved, that sinneth not." Ecclesiastes 7, verse 20, "For there is not a just man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not." Notice if we turn over to Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3. Begin reading verse 9. "What then? Are we better than they? No, and no wise. For we have before proved, both Jews and Gentiles, that they are all under sin." They're all under sin. "As it is written, there's none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understandeth. There's none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way. They are together, Jew and Gentile, all people, become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good." And to emphasize that, no, not one. Romans 3, verse 23, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." Not only have all sinned, all continue to sin. And all continue to come short of the glory of God. So each of us here, saved or unsaved, we're either saved sinners or unsaved sinners. Two kinds of sinners. Only two. We hear the publican cry, "God be merciful to me, a sinner." And each one of us can say with the publican, "Me, a sinner." It's true of all of us. Me, a sinner. Regardless of one's thoughts about the matter, for each one it is, "Me, a sinner." Regardless of our genealogy, regardless of our upbringing, regardless of our religion, each one of us, "Me, a sinner." No person living upon earth is exempt from those three words. Me, a sinner. Now in the parable, it's true of both the Pharisee and the publican. But only the publican realized and felt the fact that he was a sinner. Me, a sinner. So what does that mean? You can ask most people, "Are you a sinner?" And most would agree that, yes, I'm a sinner. But what does that mean to you? Now you get into something entirely different. What does it mean that we're a sinner? Well, what do sinners do? Sinners sin. That's why they're called sinners. That's what they do. They sin. To sin is simply to transgress the law of God. Whether you do it in your mind, whether you do it outwardly, it's simply to transgress the law of God. We read in 1 John 3 verse 4, "Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth the law, also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law." So sinners sin. In other words, sinners violate the law of God. And we say, "Me, a sinner." Sinners go aside from who and what God is. Sinners go aside from what God has said. They do so in their thoughts, their deeds, and their words. In light of such, we need to hear those words. "Me, a sinner." Sinners sin. And sin is a crime against God. Many would, this is where they would, "Well, I've never committed a crime." Well, that's what you do when you sin. It is a crime against God. It is opposing God. It is an uprising. It is a rebellion against God. Sin is always a reaction against God. It's against God. That simply means it's anti-will to God's will. In light of such, we need to hear those words. "Me, a sinner." Sinners sin. Sin is striving and contending against God. It is a defiance of God. In light of those words, in light of that, we need to hear those words. "Me, a sinner." Sinners sin, and sin is a twisting and a perverting of what God has said. It is an aversion to God. And in light of those words, again, we need to hear, "Me, a sinner." Sinners sin. And sin's direction is always away from God. It is moving away from God. "Me, a sinner." Sinners sin. Sin is an act of ingratitude toward God. And this in the face of His authority, His power, His goodness, His love, His grace, His mercy, His long-suffering, His holiness. In light of such, we need to hear those words. "Me, a sinner." This is serious business. I'm a sinner. That's very serious. Sinners sin. And sin is blasphemy and irreverence of God. It is a disregard for God. In light of such, we need to hear those words. "Me, a sinner." Sinners sin. And sin has the very nature, feature, and behavior of Satan. That's what Satan does. And when we sin, we have the very nature, the very features, the very behavior of Satan. And we need to hear those words. "Me, a sinner." Sinners sin. And we're all sinners. And there's nothing more monstrous than sin. There's nothing more detestable. There's nothing more despicable. There's nothing more vile and corrupt. There's nothing more dishonorable. There's nothing more ungodlike than sin. There's nothing more shameful and disgraceful as sin. And in light of such, we need to hear those words. Me, a sinner. Sin separates from God. Me, a sinner. Sin brings damage. Every sin brings some degree of damage. We may never perceive it, but in every sin, there's damage, there's loss. Sin is disabling. Sin is debilitating. Sin is decimating. Sin is paralyzing. Oh, the enslaving and controlling power of sin. The blinding power of sin. The spreading power of sin. The crippling power of sin. The stripping power of sin. And me, a sinner. Me, a sinner. All sinners. And sinners sin. And sin has taken more than any thief. And it has caused more heartache and misery than any other plague or enemy of mankind. It has wrought more destruction than any so-called natural disaster or tragedy. In light of such, hear those words. Me, a sinner. The multiplicity of a single sin. There's no such thing as one sin. Because within every sin is a multiplicity of sins. And the filth of a single sin, the multiplicity, the guilt, and me a sinner. No one can measure just how wrong sin is. Can't be measured. No one can measure just how bad it is. How corrupt. How vile. How reprehensible to a holy God. How abominable it is to a holy God. How offensive it is to a holy God. How grievous a so-called single sin. And yet it is true of each one of us at this very moment. Me, a sinner. So in the parable, there is God. There is the sinner. And so it is right now. There is God, and there is the sinner. And we want to see how the sinner is portrayed in the Pharisee and in the publican. Again, it's the Lord's story about two great sinners. They both went up to the temple to pray. They're both guilty. They're both vile. They're both wicked sinners. And what we see in the Pharisee and the publican describes us all. Everyone here identifies with one or the other. The Pharisee or the publican. The Pharisee. Pharisees are everywhere. We've preached on Pharisees many times. Everyone by nature is born a Pharisee. The Pharisee in the parable knew not, did not recognize, did not acknowledge that he was a sinner before God. The Pharisee, he feels good about himself. He feels satisfied with his standing before God. All based upon who he is. All based upon himself. The Pharisee represents the dominant idea in Judaism at the time of Christ. The dominant religious idea throughout world history and even now. If you are a good person and you're your own standard on what's good, so everybody's good, you are acceptable to God. This Pharisee's not trying, in the parable, is not trying to work his way to heaven. He just believes that he's just good enough in and of himself. Again, the target audience is those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. This Pharisee, so wrapped up in his own goodness and importance, and therefore he's very proud, he's self-righteous, he's boastful in himself. And in his prayer, and Christ makes sure he tells us it was really a prayer to himself, he expressed great confidence in himself. He boasts of his business honesty and his morality. Verse 11, I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers. So who's he measuring himself by? Sinners. It's a wrong measuring stick. In verse 12, he took great confidence in his religious deeds. He prayed, he fasted, he gave alms. In verse 11, he twice compared or measured himself to others. I am not as other men, or even as this publican. And by so doing, he feels pretty good about himself. But again, he had a wrong standard. The standard is laid out in Matthew 5:48. Be ye perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. That's the standard. This Pharisee, which is what all Pharisees do, put himself on a pedestal. And he trusted himself. Self-righteousness is a family disease of all the children of Adam. We are by nature self-righteous. It's something we have to fight against all the time. That's why we need to realize these words need to sink in. Me, a sinner. By nature, we think more highly of ourselves than we ought. In the Pharisees' so-called prayer, there is no sense of personal sin, no sense of personal need because of sin. There is no acknowledgement of guilt. Therefore, he seeks no mercy. He seeks no grace. He seeks no forgiveness. He's just thankful that he's not unrighteous. Oh, the arrogancy. Self-exalted. He goes away justified, acceptable, and approved by God in his own mind. The Pharisee believed in himself. He believed that he had some merit before God. He believed that he had acceptance in and of himself with God. He believed that he was good enough. And you ask most people, Do you know you're going to heaven? Well, I feel I'm a pretty good person. That's Pharisees. I haven't killed anybody. And even if they did, they'd justify it, so I'm still a pretty good person. But the story changes in verse 13 with these words. And the publican. And the publican. The difference between the Pharisee and the publican is the work of God. Verse 13, as a result of God's work upon him, this publican knows that he's a sinner. He not only knows it, he feels it deep within. He is standing afar off, perhaps in a secluded corner, because he feels unworthy to be in the presence of God. He is so filled with guilt and shame that his eyes are fixed upon the ground. It says that he would not lift up so much his eyes unto heaven. So broken, so dejected, that he cannot look up. See him there. He's overwhelmed with guilt and shame. He knows he's unworthy of the least of God's favor. He knows he's a swindler. He knows he's unjust. He knows he's dishonest. He knows he's a cheat and corrupt and immoral. He knows it, he feels it, he believes it, and he confesses it. He's heavy-hearted because he's feeling the weight of his sin. And he feels this enormous need because of his sin. And there's not even a hint of attitude that would say, well, I know that I'm a sinner, but at least I'm here in the temple. A lot of other people weren't. I might be a tax collector, but I'm not as bad as so-and-so. You want to talk about a rotten tax collector, that guy's really bad. I'm not that. But notice his behavior. He smote upon his breast as an evidence that he knew what was in him. He knew what was in him. We as God's people need to know what's in us. What's in us. He beats upon his chest as if to say, herein lies the problem. Herein is the problem. It's a sign of deep emotion. It's a sign of self-accusation. It's a gesture that demonstrates extreme anguish. And he cries, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. He went directly to God. The Pharisee prayed with himself. This man went directly to God. He's saying, God, I know that I deserve to be consumed just as this burnt offering. That's still true of all of us that are saved. We still deserve to be consumed. Why? Me, a sinner. He is saying, he's not saying, God be merciful to me for I'm not a Pharisee. And he's not saying, God be merciful to me, I'll try to do better. He simply says, God be merciful to me, a sinner. I'm a sinner. There's no merit to plead. There are no excuses. You listen to many, if not most, of God's people when they start to confess sin. Listen carefully. They're going to blame somebody somewhere along the line, or they're going to blame their circumstances. It has not fully gripped them. I'm a sinner. I'm a sinner. Because the only thing you can plead when you realize that is, God, be merciful. So he's conscious of his own sinfulness. He's humble. He knows he's unworthy. Every child of God ought to be humble because we're still sinners. We were sinners when he saved us, and we're still sinners in spite of him saving us. We're still unworthy. Still unworthy. Well, I go to church. It will not make up for one single sin. It will not pay that debt. He's brokenhearted. As he says, me, a sinner. In fact, I believe that sin lay so heavily upon him that he felt there was no sinner like him. No sinner like him. Just like Paul, the chief of sinners. He knows that he has no personal merit to plead. And when we begin to plead personal merit, you're headed down a dangerous road. Because there's another side of that coin as well. No one had to tell him what to say. No one had to tell him he was a sinner. He knew it. He knew it. No one had to tell him to repeat this prayer, God be merciful to me, a sinner. No, he knew he was a sinner, and out it came. God be merciful to me, a sinner. He's casting himself upon the Lord. And when these three words get a hold of us, me, a sinner, that's exactly what we will do. We will cast ourselves upon the Lord. By God's grace and by God's mercy, we were brought to this place in our salvation experience. God be merciful to me, a sinner. And now here we are. We're saved. We have a wonderful life to live. We're on our way to glory. Still a sinner. A saved sinner, but still a sinner. No righteousness to plead. We need His grace. We need His mercy. In and of ourselves, no merit. None. And when these words get a hold of us, me a sinner, our eye will be upon God's mercy, not upon ourselves. May we never lose sight of me a sinner. Me a sinner. Again, a saved sinner. And a characteristic of a saved sinner ought to be humility. No room whatsoever for self-righteousness. None. None. And one day, me a sinner will be no more. When we get to heaven, no more sinner. No more. So we have the victory. But again, these three words, me a sinner, and we'll get into this in our second message, ought to cause us to have a deep love and gratitude for the mercy and the grace of God. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us in a verse of Psalm